Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Supernatural, the pilot episode. So, going into this, we have, of course, Supernatural that has ended. And so, a lot of people will probably say, like, why are you going into this episode now after the show is over? Well, anybody could catch this show at any point in time. Anyone could become fans of this. And that's what like Supernatural being on Netflix right now is for, that eventually anyone will eventually find this show and eventually watch it. And eventually it might not be on Netflix forever, but it is what it is. Because maybe it'll probably be on like HBO Max or something like that. Anyways, so going on into this episode, there is actually a lot to unpack for this pilot episode because we're basically like we're giving the origin story of Sam and Dean. We're like how they like really needed to become these demoned vampire monster ghost whichever hunters, and how eventually they how they kind of eventually skewed and like went about their own lives, like Sam kind of going and like, dude, I'm out of this business, I want to go and do something else. Then eventually I'll like probably at some point in time need to help somebody, but we'll get to that. John Winchester, we're gonna kind of show like the opening and stuff like that of this character, and then eventually we're gonna just have to go and search after this character, go and do this whole road trip of a thing to eventually make our way back to John Winchester. So, with that said, this is a kind of interesting show that, like, probably the first episode may not sell people, but eventually, once you get further on, like, especially once you start seeing some fun episodes, like, I think my favorite episode is still probably Tall Tales. Like, that's probably the funniest episode to me, and I think it's kind of fun, but other people will like other episodes, and that's perfectly fine. Hopefully no one comes in here as a Supernatural expert, because more than likely I'll just say, why don't you have a Supernatural review channel? And if they don't, it's like, well, and if they do, it'll be like, oh, okay, great. Like, why are you here? I don't know. But let's go on to review this episode. So, the cliff notes of this episode, the teeing it up, just because in case somebody doesn't remember what this episode is about, laying a lot of groundwork. So what ends up happening is we are to showcase that there is an event that forces John Winchester to eventually become a hunter, and has basically both of his sons growing up to be them as well. But then eventually Sam decides that he is going to go off to college and create his own path. But eventually John is to go missing during this case of 10 men that had disappeared for one reason or another. So Dean is to have to go and grab Sam to just say, hey, like, I need your help with this case. Like, I need your help finding our dad. And coincidentally, they don't wrap this whole missing father up thing in the very pilot episode. Like, we get to a point where it seems like we're going through this whole entire story for a whole entire season, where they are to eventually find their father. So, eventually that is to mean that probably Sam is going to be roped back into this business, even though it seems that Sam is to have a job opportunity lined up, a lawyer thing to be lined up. Like, I guess that technically does like spoil this movie, but here's the thing, like, anybody could probably see through any number of pictures of any of these episodes that, like, Sam is to eventually, for one reason or another, carry on our wayward son, if you know what I mean. So, like, it feels like that may seem like a spoiler, but there's a whole reason why Sam is to eventually get back into the family business of things. So, with that said, there's a lot going on in this first episode, and so maybe there's going to be something that I had forgotten because there's so much to unpack in this episode. Or there might be some things that I deem important compared to what little thing that I might have slipped or missed or whatever while going and talking about this review of the pilot episode. So, with that said, I'm going to go out of my way to say that it is about that coveted time yet again, to go into spoilers about this episode, so I think it's that coveted time to otherwise say, one, if you're a Supernatural fan and you're going to cling on to here, like, I will definitely go into doing the review of these episodes. Like, I don't care how old the show is, like, I don't care if it just, like, if people are interested in like talking about this show or whatever. Some people like it, some people are whichever. Because a lot of people caught this show at a different time. This show lasted forever. Like, I think this show was like the highest rated ratings wise show for the CW, because like it hit everybody. It hit every single like kind of age range and audience member and whatever. Plus, also, it had a lot of attractive guys in the show to just appeal to a lot of female audiences as well. And then eventually it was like Arrow, and it was like Flash, and then it was like they like had to like figure out any number of other just kind of shows they can just hope to get as high as ratings as like Supernatural did. But anyways, let's go on to go into the coveted double 5 time territory, because it is spoiler time, baby. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time we get to spoil this movie. So, or this show, I mean. I always get it confused. So, hopefully there's not a Supernatural expert that is going to come on here. Just like, well, this one little tidbit of whatever. I'm like, okay, great. Like, people can watch the episode and like, or just like copy and paste from some article somewhere. Like, I get it. Like, there's some people that are very nice about it, but then there's also other people that are to just kind of not exactly be nice about it. Like, I feel anybody can review anything any kind of way, so I think it's about that time to say, let's go into this. So, the very beginning of this pilot episode is to have Mary Winchester be walking through her home. Mary is to go to check up on Sam, and who is in a crib because he's a baby. And so Mary is to go to look into Sam's room to see that there is a man hovering over Sam's crib. Mary is to naturally assume that it's John Winchester, so Mary asks this man something, and he is to mutter something, and Mary is to walk off. So Mary is to make her way down the stairs to eventually go and check downstairs to find out that John Winchester is actually downstairs, like, and he had fallen asleep while watching TV. So Mary runs up the stairs to try to see who is the person that is to be the man hovering over Sam. We're going to find out sometime later that the guy that was to be at Sam's crib was the yellow-eyed demon. Like, I don't remember exactly what this person's name is, and we'll eventually find that later on. But, like, that's, like, the nickname that this guy's to be given for the longest time, the yellow-eyed demon. And if really there is an actual name of that, great, because like we won't see him for a while. So if anybody is to tell me the actual name of the character or whichever, we're not going to see this guy for I don't know how long. So, because I don't remember exactly what episode he comes back on, and I know there's somebody gonna, yeah, it's season 2, episode 4. I get it. Like, people like to, like, yeah. Anyways, I get it. It's great. It's great. So, Mary goes scrambling back up into the room to try to defend her Sam against what is to be quite possibly a demon. And so that leads to John now having to, like, kind of see what the heck the matter of anything is. So John goes up to the room to eventually spot that Mary is to be stuck to the ceiling and she is to be bursting into flame. And so John is to grab Sam and is to get Dean and like, dude, we need to get out of here. Both of them are scrambling out of the house. Mary, sadly, is dead, and so the house is just burning down. So here's the weird thing, though. We have Dean with, like, really long hair, and we have Sam, who's baby, who has really short hair. And I'm like, shouldn't roles be reversed? Did they not know which one was going to be Sam or Dean here? Like, like, were they maybe thinking that Jared was going to be, like, Sam, or was going to be Dean, and Dean was going to be Sam? Like, we're... I don't know, it's a nitpicky thing, but, like, when you look at any of the other flashbacks, they get it right after that. I guess they're just like, well, like, we just chose whatever kids would work well. Like, they didn't care what kind of hairstyle it, like, matched up to the guys or whatever. Anyways, so... Plus, like, this is pilot episode. They didn't probably know that this show was probably going to get picked up or whichever, so it is what it is. So, let's get into, like, certain... Like, I'm not going to do this episode perfectly. I'm definitely not. So, normal opening screen, whichever. So, anyways, we have a guy who is to be driving down a certain part of a road to eventually go and pick up a woman. A woman who is all wearing white. So this man is to talk to this woman, and this girl who is to be Candace is to want this guy to drive her home. And this guy is like, oh yeah, I'm definitely going to be driving you home. Ooh. Because evidently this guy is to supposedly be another unfaithful husband, whichever. So what ends up happening is that they are to drive home, and once this guy is to drive this woman home, this guy is to naturally assume that this girl is just going to go home. But she is to say that she can't go home. And so the guy's like, okay. So what are we doing here? Like, what is the purpose here? So eventually the guy is to get out of the car because the woman is to seemingly disappear. And so now the guy is very confused. He starts to head into the home, or like starts to kind of poke his head into the home to see that this house is very broken down, disheveled, and like no justifiable person would probably be living here. And so now this guy is a little weirded out, and he's kind of like, okay, like, joke's over kind of thing. It's like, come on, like, what are we doing here? So all of a sudden, this guy gets spooked and freaked out to the point of him running back into his car, driving and smashing into a sign of this bridge, and then the car is to stop and he is to get killed on this bridge. I guess there is actually a significance to this bridge in this episode, plus also there is a significance to this house. So, pushing on. So, we are to show the life of Sam Winchester. So, Sam is to be going to college, and he is to have a girlfriend named Jessica. Both Sam and Jessica are to supposedly go to a Halloween party. Sam is not dressing up as anything because frickin' he's like, dude, I've seen so many Halloween things enough. Like, I'm not going to dress up as anybody. Let me pause here to do a little bit of a reset. All right. So we are to find out that it seems that things school-wise are going very well for Sam, to where he is to be getting a interview for a job possibility for like doing something with like being a lawyer or something along those lines. But things are going just well for Sam. Uh, like I keep hearing things about like Harvard or being a lawyer or something like that somewhere in. Like in here, but that's eventually just going to become a quick passing thing eventually. So both Sam and Jessica are to go home, snuggle up together, while Jessica is to be wearing some Smurf shirt that, of course, is a little bit of a like low toppy, like pajama whatever thing, and so all of a sudden Sam is to hear a clatter and he wakes up to see what the matter is. And so Sam goes and is to try to take down this burglar, but this burglar is not to be an actual burglar. He is to be a burger eating man called Dean Winchester. So they're fighting one another, and so Sam is to basically mention to Dean, it's like, well, I could have taken you. And Dean is like, well, yeah, you're out of practice. You're a little rusty. And so that's why you couldn't take me. Yeah, I guess these guys have spent years upon years practicing to be good at what they do. But I guess Sam at this point just wasn't good enough because out of practice. So that is to wake up Jessica and be like, what's going on? And so Sam is to introduce Dean to Sam, or like Sam is to introduce Dean to Jessica, and so Dean is like, wow, like kind of just impressed that that Sam has snagged a woman like this, because you're gonna find out that Sam doesn't really snag women all that often, but Dean does it all the time. Like there's gonna be catering episodes where it's just gonna focus on Dean. Like, hey, this is random woman that Dean slept with once. And, like, it's always going to be that way. And eventually, it's going to get to the point where we're going to have, like, Dean basically, at some point, there's, like, a whole entire season where he's to, like, sleep with as billions of women as he can and, like, eat till the cows come home because he knows where he's going anyways. So, but we'll get there. We'll get there. I don't want to seem like a supernatural expert because then eventually someone will come in here and say something that I said inaccurately. It happens. So, moving on. So, Dean is now wanting to tell Sam about what had happened to their dad. And Sam is like, well, anything that you can say to me, you can say to me and Jessica. Like, it's fine. So, Dean is to mention that there is that there is to have had John go to be on a hunting trip and he hasn't come back in 3 weeks. And 3 weeks kind of sounds really, like, scary even for John. So Sam is like, okay, like, so now, like, Sam is now going with Dean into the car to really see, like, what their dad was working on. So Dean is to showcase that John was working on a case where 10 men had gone missing, and it was always from this same stretch of road, and it was always, like, in this same kind of location. And so, because Dean and John had separated, because Dean had went and did a case in New Orleans, and kind of John was working on this case. So both Dean and Sam go to a place called Jericho, and so, like, and Sam was also asking Dean, it's like, well, how is it that you did a case on your own? And Dean was like, dude, I'm 26, man. Like, and so, but here's the weird thing. So Sam did a case on his own, or Dean did a case on his own. And so Sam is now asking, it's like, well, like, then what do you need me for? And Dean is just like, well, I don't want to do this case alone. Like, I could, but I just don't want to. And so Sam is like, okay, well, I'm just letting you know, like, by Monday, like, I need to be back here because I have an interview. And you consistently have Dean that is to have that consistently slip his mind, because Dean is to consistently ask Sam, it's like, well, is that really what you really want to do? Is that like, that's what you're really gonna like? And Sam is like, yes, that's what I want to do. So we're gonna have this like purpose thing where like they're gonna just get to like the very the very tail end of that like of that like day where Sam is gonna have to go on to do this interview because this case is gonna take way too long. So so anything pushing on here. So what they end up doing is both Sam and Dean are to arrive at the case where the guy was to be killed at this bridge. So Dean is to flash a badge saying that he's a U.S. Marshal, and the deputy is to say, like, aren't you a little young to be U.S. Marshal? And Dean is like, ha ha ha, ha yeah, like, I guess people could say that. So Dean is to also, like, ask the deputy, it's like, well, what is your assumption on this case? Because there have been a lot of people, like, gone missing, and so, like, what do you think that this is? And so the deputy is like, well, it's probably some kidnapping racket or, like, some kind of, like, mass murdering thing, like, that's what we're thinking that it is. And Dean is like, oh, so, like, you don't know, like, you obviously don't know anything like any normal cop in this situation would. And so Sam is now pushing Dean and just like, hey, man, like, you shouldn't be rude to these guys because maybe it'll come back to bite you, because eventually it will. So pushing on. So what ends up happening is that Sam and Dean are just kind of going about the town and like starting to ask people questions. Eventually, they are to both go to a diner where there is to be two women there that are to say, like, well, I guess there is a ghost story kind of going around about a woman in white who is to like go and kill people. And like there's like a ghost story of that kind of roaming around in this place. Like I guess it has something to do with the centennial or something with that story. So Sam and Dean both go and are to kind of go into a library and look for some news reports, and they can't figure out exactly how to narrow this whole thing down. So what ends up happening is that they are to eventually find a case that ties to the centennial, but it is to be a suicide, not a murder. So the story is that we have this woman called Constance Welsh who was to go and leave her kids into this tub, and she ends up finding out later that her kids ending up drowning in this tub. And so I guess from the grief of that, Constance had went off this bridge and like jumped off and drowned. We have Joseph Welsh who had went to this bridge, and like so we find out that that Constance and Joseph were married. And so eventually later on in this episode, we do have Sam who is to eventually go and find this Joseph and talk to him, but we'll get to that. So hopefully, if I remember all of it, because there's a lot to unpack in this episode. So so both Dean and Sam are to go back to this bridge because they are to realize, like, well, I guess this bridge is much more important than we thought it was. So both Sam and Dean go back to this bridge to kind of see exactly where this woman could have jumped off to, so maybe they can find the body and burn the remains. Because if anything, both John or both Sam and Dean were kind of confused why John like never just burnt the body. Because if this is an obvious like ghost story, most of the time you need to burn uh the ghosts like remains, like their skull or their bones or their whatever, to have forcibly this ghost to then move on. So both Sam and Dean are trying to maybe look for the body like by this bridge to kind of like figure out if they can go and like try to find this body somewhere to burn its remains. All of a sudden we have their car that is to come back to life, or to come to life and start driving and starting to try to run Sam and Dean over, which pushes both of our men to then like basically dive to get the heck out of the way of this car. Dean is to eventually get all like dirty and all muddy and whatever, and so but after that the car like stops moving, and so reasonably we have Sam, because we have Sam who is just kind of asking a lot of questions about both John and both Dean, and like basically like all the stuff that had kind of like led up to like these moments and whichever. Uh, but anyways, like they also had a last message that Dean was to record of John talking to Dean. And bizarrely, they fixed the recording so that way there was like a background sound of Constance. And so kind of proving that there is like a ghostly presence. And John was working on this case, but then went somewhere else for both Sam and Dean to work on this case. Because what ends up happening shortly thereafter this is both Sam and Dean are to go to a hotel to then get a room. They end up finding out that John had rented a room out for a month. And so they're like, okay, great. Like, we'll get that room then. We'll like, we'll just sleep in that room. So they find out that John had previously, like, rented out this room and was trying to figure out this whole case. And had, like, a whole, like, pentagram or whichever, like, trying to, like, piece all these pieces together. And eventually that led to that Constance Welsh article that both Sam and Dean had already read. So, anyways, that is to lead us to have Dean like leave the hotel room, and what ends up happening is these deputies and this sheriff are to eventually look into Sam and Dean's credentials and find out they are false. So Dean ends up getting arrested, and so Dean is letting Sam know, hey, yeah, the cops are here, like, get the heck out of here. So Dean is to get arrested to be hauled in to have the sheriff start to question Dean, and that ends up having Dean, of course, find out that John had left his journal here, and so the sheriff is thumbing through this and trying to figure out that maybe John has some connection with these murders, or maybe Dean does. So, because really they aren't who they say they were. Plus, also, they have racked up a pretty decent credit card fraud, and like Dean has, because supposedly Sam had asked Dean when they were to pay for this hotel room, like, how exactly are you guys paying this? Are both of you still doing credit card fraud? And Dean is like, heck yeah, like, if anything, we're like just continuing to fill out fake names and fake addresses and whatever, and they are to send the cards out to us. And so like it's not our fault that these stupid people are just to continue to like give people credit cards. So so pushing on. So Sam is to go out to go and talk with Joseph and to eventually ask him if, hey, like, you didn't remarry, or like, hey, why didn't you like ever like stay living at that home? Joseph is to mention that since his kids died and his wife died, like Joseph was like, I just needed to move out. Like I just needed to go somewhere else. So, and I guess no one lived in there afterwards just because of like the legacy that it has had. So Sam is to mention the whole backstory of a woman in white, and how there is that legend that is to be had out here that normally the attachment of a woman in white could be of a person who had an affair with someone else. And so Sam, in a kind of nice way, is kind of asking Sam, hey, did you ever sleep with another woman besides your wife? Because Sam is to ask Joseph, it's like, well, hey, like, so did you ever get married to another woman? And Joseph is like, no, like, if anything, Constance was the love of my wife, or the love of my life, I mean. So Sam is like, well, that's kind of weird, because if anything, like, I feel like Constance could be tied to this whole, like, woman in white kind of thing, and that has something to do with, like, having an affair. So like, and Joseph is just like, you know what, I'm freaking done talking to you. And so Joseph starts to walk off, and so Sam is like, yeah, this guy had an affair, like, so like that's the reason why this is, well, I guess that's the reason why like Constance may have killed her children and then jumped off a bridge because of her husband's affair. So so Dean is to have John's journal, and on the very end of the John's journal, there is to be the letters of some kind of location that John was to be at. And so, reasonably, I guess, in a very cryptic way, that is a sign saying like, okay, like John needs help and he's going to be at this location, so go and try to find him. So while there is a 911 call that scrambles all of the police officers from out of this prison, Dean is to find a paperclip and is to be able to uncuff himself and to grab John's journal and get the heck out of this prison. So Dean is to call Sam and say, "Hey, like, thanks for the fake 911 call. Like, I really appreciate it because I could have easily slipped out of there." And so Sam is like, "Well, yeah, like I figure that's the only way to have been able to get you to easily escape." So now, what ends up happening is like Sam is on the road, and he is to go down the stretch of road where Constance was, and eventually while Sam is to be driving, Constance appears into the back of the car, and that scares Sam a little bit. And so Dean is thinking that of course Sam is in trouble, so Dean is now scrambling to eventually head to where Sam of course is in any way that he can. So Sam is now talking to Constance and like trying to be like kind of convenient about everything. So Constance is eventually like forcing Sam, either one way or another, to head back to her home, and that's basically where Sam was going to head anyways. So it's convenient. Uh, so Constance is going from the back seat to then appear in the front seat. So, because Sam already knows what's going on, and so Constance is not going to be putting on a show for Sam, because, like, Constance realized that Sam knows good and well that this woman is a ghost. So, pushing on. So, eventually we get to Constance home, and Constance is, of course, to mention that she can't go home. And so Constance is to try to jump on top of Sam, and Sam is like, "You can't get to me because I'm not going to be unfaithful." And Constance is like, "Well, there's a way around that too." So Dean is to scramble to make his way to where Sam is. And so while Constance is trying to suck the life out of Sam, Dean is consistently fire silver bullets into this car and like try to consistently take down this ghost, but she just keeps reappearing to try to suck the life out of Sam. Like Sam also tried to stop driving to Constance's home, but eventually Constance took control of the car to force Sam to make it to her home. So it was kind of inevitable. So what ends up happening is Sam decides, well, F it. You know what? Like, if you don't want to go home, you're going to go home anyways. So Sam takes the car and drives the car into Constance's home. And then all of a sudden, both Sam and Dean are both in the home as well. So all of a sudden, we are to have Constance just try to make her way like through this home. All of a sudden, we are to see like a bunch of water that is to be trickling down these flights of stairs at this kind of old, disheveled home. So Constance is to be going up the stairwell to see at the top of the very beginning of, or the top of this stairwell, we are to see two kids holding hands. And so all of a sudden, these two kids are to be on the top of the stairwell, but then are to come like from one place to where Constance is and to hug her. And that just creates Constance and her kids to, like, her kids are forcing Constance to move on. So that way this basically gets rid of this ghost. So it's like, okay, well, I guess that solves everything. So, like, Dean also was to like give Sam crap as like, if you ruined my car, like, you're gonna be dead. Like, so pushing on. So after this case is to be solved, now Sam is reminding Dean, hey, I have 10 hours before my interview, like, we need to make it back home. And Dean is like, oh yeah, like, there's this consistent time where Dean is like, oh yeah, that's right, I completely forgot, or I wanted to just make you forget on purpose. Because but Sam is always like ticking, like freaking, like checking on the time consistently, like knowing exactly the day that he needs to be there. At some point, we have Jessica, who had called Sam and just say, okay, it's Saturday, and like, it's this time, and where are you? So Sam is to go back home to kind of lay his head on his bed and like to realize that it's like, hey man, all I need is like X amount of hours of sleep, and then I'll be good for my interview. So Sam is to all of a sudden go and just rest on his bed. He's like, ah, great. Like, I solved the case. If anything, like, I didn't solve where the heck my dad is, but eventually that will be a thing for a whole entire season to go into for most of this. Anyways, so Sam is sleeping on his bed, just like, like, I can now just conk out. All of a sudden, we have these driblets of blood coming onto Sam's head. And he's like, what the heck? Am I having a water leak? What's going on? But no, he's having a blood leak. He's having a blood leak from Jessica being to be on the ceiling, and she is going to burst into flame. Dean is eventually going to find Sam burning in his home, and so Dean and Sam get the heck out of there. So police are called. Things are to be like reported and whichever. So all of a sudden, like, Dean is to make his way back to the car, and so Sam is already gearing up to go and hunt again. Because basically, like, at this point, Sam's only one thing that was keeping him away from doing anything with his brother or his father or anything was Jessica, to just get back to her normal life. Now that that basically is snuffed out, Sam is like, well, okay, I'm gonna go and find whatever the heck this is that had killed my woman, because like I want this to stop. So that's kind of the way that this episode is to like come about. Uh, but yeah, so interestingly enough, we're going to eventually see where this story is to head to. But like this is just kind of the first episode, and plus there was a lot to unpack in this episode. If there was something that I forgot, if there was some little minute detail that I whatever, like I always have to say that it's like, well, hey, like that could quite possibly be what the next review might be. It might just be my rebuttal, or it might just be like, hey, sorry, I forgot this, because a lot of stuff could bug the crap out of me that I didn't say something or whichever. But that's a mistake that you make when you have like an episode completely done all by memory. Because like I'm not like there was at a point where I just kind of like would do little cliff things or whichever. But I'm not going to do that like I'm not going to do that often anymore. If there's a heavily complex thing that I felt like I need to eventually just dot things down every once in a while, I'll do that. But mostly I just go with the cast list. Mostly I just see like, okay, like I remember this person and whichever. But so I like the show. Hopefully everyone will enjoy these reviews and want to come on here because they're Supernatural fans. I like this show as well as many others, so maybe if you like a lot of other supernatural like things, then eventually like just subscribe to this channel just because of that, because I definitely like supernatural stuff. Like Ghostbusters, paranormal stuff. Like I like all that kind of thing, and like doing this show wasn't a way for me to try to like sucker anybody in for liking any of that other like other stuff or liking this. Like I just said like, well, it's like I should have gotten to this a long time ago, but I just never did. And so now like since this show was technically complete, like now I think I can easily go back and watch like the whole run of it and just enjoy it with anyone else who had also enjoyed this show. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye everybody. Bye everybody.